August 15th, 1988 dawned like any other summer Monday in Dallas, Texas. The temperature had already reached 85 degrees by 7 a.m., promising another scorching day in a summer full of record heat. At Trinity Park, the early morning joggers and dog walkers were making their usual rounds, trying to beat the worst of the day's heat. Among them was Martin Reynolds, a 42-year-old accountant who had recently taken up running as part of his doctor's orders to improve his cardiovascular health. At precisely 6:47 a.m., Reynolds veered off the main trail toward a secluded area to retie his shoelace. That's when he noticed something unusual beneath the sprawling branches of a live oak tree, a flash of pale blue fabric, partially obscured by tall grass. As he approached, the morning breeze carried a distinct smell that made him stop in his tracks. What Reynolds discovered in those next moments would forever alter the peaceful perception of Trinity Park and launch one of the most complex investigations in Dallas history. The body of 19-year-old Eliza Thornton lay carefully arranged on the ground, her University of Texas at Dallas student ID still clipped to the pocket of her denim jacket. She had been reported missing just 12 hours earlier by her roommate, Nora Wilkins, after failing to return from her evening shift at Beacon Books, an independent bookstore in downtown Dallas, where she worked part-time to help fund her education. The positioning of the body wasn't random, Detective Ray Mendoza would later note in his initial report. There was purpose in how she was placed, almost like a display. Mendoza, a 15-year veteran of the Dallas Police Department's Homicide Division, had seen his share of crime scenes, but something about this one immediately struck him as methodical, the work of someone who had taken their time, who hadn't acted in passion or panic. His partner, Detective Vanessa Wright, a former forensic technician who had transferred to homicide just 3 months prior, focused immediately on the ground surrounding the body. The perpetrator was careful, she documented. There were partial shoe prints, size 11 or 12 men's, but they disappeared at the edge of the park's paved pathway. He knew to stay on hard surfaces to avoid leaving tracks. The crime scene yielded frustratingly little physical evidence. A few synthetic fibers that didn't match Eliza's clothing, some partial fingerprints on her student ID that later proved to be her own, and microscopic traces of an uncommon blue dye on her fingernails. The medical examiner would later determine that Eliza had died between 9 p.m. and midnight the previous evening, placing her death just hours after she was last seen leaving work at 8:30 p.m. News of the murder spread through Dallas like wildfire. By nightfall, local stations interrupted regular programming with special reports. The headline in the next morning's Dallas Morning News read, "UTD student found murdered in Trinity Park," accompanied by Eliza's senior portrait from the previous year, a smiling young woman with auburn hair and a confident gaze, studying international relations with dreams of working for the United Nations. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Over 200 people gathered for a candlelight vigil outside the university's student center the following evening. Eliza's professors described her as intellectually curious and destined for significant achievements. Her parents, Kenneth and Martha Thornton, flew in from Portland, Oregon, appearing shell-shocked as they made a brief statement pleading for information about their daughter's killer. Eliza believed in justice, her father said, his voice barely audible. She believed in a world where wrongs could be made right. We're asking, begging, anyone with information to come forward. The investigation quickly established Eliza's movements on that fateful Sunday. Security footage showed her leaving Beacon Books at 8:32 p.m. after closing the store. She spoke briefly with a co-worker, Blake Sutton, before heading toward the bus stop 2 blocks away that would take her back to her apartment near campus. The route would have required her to transfer buses downtown, but there was no evidence she ever boarded the first bus. Detectives Mendoza and Wright interviewed dozens of potential witnesses within the first 72 hours. The bus driver remembered seeing a young woman matching Eliza's description waiting at the stop, but couldn't confirm if she had boarded. A street vendor packing up his souvenir stand recalled seeing a young woman with auburn hair speaking with a man near a dark-colored sedan, but couldn't provide any details about the man's appearance or the vehicle's make and model. We're dealing with an urban area with hundreds of people moving through it, yet somehow this young woman vanishes between point A and point B with barely anyone noticing, Mendoza told his supervisor, frustration evident in his voice. This wasn't random. Someone knew her routine. The investigation focused initially on those closest to Eliza. Her ex-boyfriend, Adrian Reeves, a 21-year-old engineering student, had been seen arguing with her at the university cafeteria 3 days before her disappearance. When questioned, Reeves admitted the argument, but insisted it was about returning belongings after their breakup 2 weeks earlier. His alibi, attending a concert with friends at a venue 30 miles away, was verified by multiple witnesses and ticket stubs. Blake Sutton, her 24-year-old co-worker at the bookstore, became a person of interest when investigators discovered he had asked Eliza out multiple times, despite her polite rejections. She wasn't interested in dating anyone right now, Nora Wilkins told detectives. She wanted to focus on her studies and her application for a study abroad program in Geneva. Sutton maintained that he and Eliza were just friends and that he had accepted her decision. His alibi checked out as well. Security footage showed him entering his apartment building less than 15 minutes after Eliza left the bookstore, and neighbors confirmed he had hosted a small gathering to watch a movie that evening. The breakthrough that investigators desperately needed came 5 days after the murder, when the forensic lab identified traces of a rare industrial-grade cleaning solvent on Eliza's clothing, a compound primarily used in commercial buildings but not typically available to the general public. This suggested the killer might have occupational access to such chemicals, potentially narrowing the field of suspects. By the 2-week mark, investigators had collected DNA evidence from the crime scene, microscopic skin cells recovered from beneath Eliza's fingernails, suggesting she had scratched her attacker. In 1988, however, DNA testing was still in its infancy. The Dallas Police Department didn't have the capability to process such evidence in-house and had to send the samples to one of the few labs in the country equipped for DNA analysis, a process that would take months and cost thousands of dollars that hadn't been budgeted for. "We're going to get this sample tested if I have to pay for it myself," Captain Gerald Hoffman announced during a departmental meeting. "This killer left us his calling card, and sooner or later, technology will catch up and tell us exactly who he is." As August turned to September, the investigation began to lose momentum. Leads dried up. Media attention waned as newer crimes demanded coverage. The reward for information leading to an arrest grew to $50,000 through community donations, but no credible tips emerged. The Thornton family returned to Portland with their daughter's remains, leaving behind a pink granite bench near the UTD library with a simple inscription, "In memory of Eliza Thornton, seeker of truth." Meanwhile, the DNA sample sat in a cold storage unit at a laboratory in Virginia, waiting for analysis, waiting for technology to advance, waiting for the day when science could reveal what witnesses could not. What no one knew then was that this sample would become the silent witness that would eventually speak volumes, but only after 3 decades of silence. As fall settled over Dallas, Detective Mendoza kept a photo of Eliza on his desk, a silent reminder of unfinished business. "Some cases get under your skin," he told Wright one evening as they reviewed the case file for the 100th time. "This one isn't going in a box, not while I'm still breathing." What neither detective could have imagined was how long the wait for justice would be, or how advances in science would eventually unlock the truth that had been hiding in plain sight for years, sealed within a killer's DNA, a genetic fingerprint patiently waiting to reveal its secrets. By December 1988, the Eliza Thornton case had officially gone cold. The once bustling investigation room in the Dallas Police Department's headquarters had been cleared out. The wall of photos and timeline markers packed away into evidence boxes and filed in the department's growing repository of unsolved homicides. Only detectives Mendoza and Wright continued to devote after-hours time to the case, their determination undiminished, even as departmental resources shifted to newer, more solvable crimes. "The first year is critical," Mendoza explained to a rookie detective who asked about the Thornton file. "After that, witnesses' memories fade, evidence deteriorates, and the trail gets colder with each passing day." The DNA evidence collected from beneath Eliza's fingernails had finally been processed in October, yielding a partial genetic profile that confirmed the presence of male DNA that didn't match any of the persons of interest. The problem was that in 1988, there was no national DNA database to compare it against. The profile simply sat in a file, a genetic puzzle piece without a matching picture. Throughout the winter of 1988 and into 1989, Mendoza and Wright continued following up on peripheral leads. They re-interviewed Blake Sutton, who had quit his job at Beacon Books shortly after the murder, citing the painful memories associated with the place. They tracked down every maintenance worker and janitor who had access to the industrial cleaning solvent found on Eliza's clothing, checking alibis and backgrounds with methodical precision. One name that briefly surfaced was Lester Hammond, a 42-year-old building maintenance supervisor who worked in several downtown office buildings, including one across from Beacon Books. Hammond had a minor criminal record, a drunk and disorderly charge from 1982 and a domestic disturbance call in 1985 that was later dropped when his girlfriend refused to press charges. He claimed to have been at home alone on the night of Eliza's murder, an alibi impossible to verify or disprove. "Hammond gives me a bad feeling," Wright noted in her personal case journal. "Something about his eyes when we asked about his whereabouts that night, like he was measuring his words too carefully. But a feeling isn't evidence." They requested a voluntary DNA sample from Hammond, who refused, citing privacy concerns. Without probable cause for a warrant, the detectives had to let it go. Hammond quit his job 3 weeks after the interview and moved to Houston, falling off their radar. Meanwhile, Eliza's parents tried to move forward with their lives while keeping their daughter's memory alive. Kenneth Thornton established a scholarship in Eliza's name at UTD for students pursuing international relations. Martha Thornton began volunteering with victim advocacy groups, channeling her grief into helping others navigate the aftermath of violent crime. "The worst part isn't just losing Eliza," Martha told a support group for parents of murdered children. "It's the not knowing who took her from us or why, living with that question mark hanging over everything." By the 1-year anniversary of Eliza's murder, the case had all but disappeared from public consciousness. A small article ran on page 6 of the Dallas Morning News, featuring a statement from Captain Hoffman assuring the public that the investigation remained open. The reality, however, was that without new leads or evidence, the case had stalled completely. In March 1990, Detective Ray Mendoza suffered a heart attack while jogging, an ironic echo of how Eliza's body had been discovered. He survived, but was forced into early retirement at age 48. At his retirement party, he pulled Detective Wright aside. "Don't let Eliza's case go," he told her, pressing a copy of his case notes into her hands. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, and some cases haunt you. This is one of them. Something tells me the answer is right in front of us. We just don't have the tools to see it yet." Wright promised, but the realities of police work made it difficult to keep. As the department's only female homicide detective at the time, she faced constant pressure to prove herself on new cases. The Thornton file was eventually transferred to the Cold Case Unit, a chronically understaffed division responsible for hundreds of unsolved homicides dating back decades. The years passed. Wright was promoted to sergeant and then lieutenant, moving into administration and away from fieldwork. Captain Hoffman retired. The officers who had been first on the scene at Trinity Park transferred to other departments or left law enforcement altogether. By 1995, almost everyone directly connected to the original investigation had moved on, and Eliza Thornton had become just another name in the cold case files. Enter Detective Marlene Dawson, a transfer from the Houston Police Department with a reputation for obsessive attention to detail and a particular interest in cold cases. Assigned to Dallas PD's cold case unit in February 1995, Dawson began systematically reviewing files, looking for cases with preserved DNA evidence that might benefit from the rapidly advancing field of genetic forensics. "The Thornton case jumped out at me," Dawson would later recall. "The investigation was solid. Mendoza and Wright had been thorough, but they were limited by the technology of the time. By 95, we could do more with less DNA than ever before." Dawson began by retracing the original investigation's steps. She visited Trinity Park and walked the route Eliza would have taken from the bookstore to the bus stop. She reviewed the autopsy findings and crime scene photos. She tracked down and re-interviewed key witnesses, including Blake Sutton, who had returned to Dallas and was now managing a different bookstore on the other side of town. "I think about her every day," Sutton told Dawson during their interview. "I keep wondering if there was something I could have done. Offered to walk her to the bus stop, noticed someone watching the store. Something." Dawson also located Lester Hammond, now working as a building superintendent in an upscale Houston apartment complex. Hammond seemed less nervous than in his original interview, but remained evasive about his whereabouts on the night of Eliza's murder. "It was 7 years ago," he told Dawson. "How is anyone supposed to remember exactly where they were on some random Sunday night?" Dubus, when pressed, Hammond eventually claimed he had been watching a baseball game on television, but couldn't recall which teams had played. This inconsistency with his original statement that he had been sleeping raised Dawson's suspicions. She began digging deeper into Hammond's background, discovering that he had lived in Seattle before Dallas, coinciding with a series of unsolved assaults on young women near bus stops. Dawson's request for a DNA sample from Hammond was again refused, and her application for a warrant was denied by a judge who deemed the connection too tenuous to justify compelled genetic testing. Without Hammond's DNA to compare against the sample from Eliza's fingernails, Dawson couldn't confirm or eliminate him as a suspect. The detective also pursued another angle that the original investigation had touched on only briefly: the possibility that Eliza's murder was connected to her academic work. As an international relations student, Eliza had been researching political asylum cases for a term paper, focusing on individuals who had fled political persecution in Central America during the height of civil conflicts there. Her professor mentioned that Eliza had been particularly interested in a controversial case involving a former government official accused of human rights violations who had been granted asylum in Texas. She was asking questions that made some people uncomfortable, Professor Lawrence Mills told Dawson. Not in a conspiratorial way. Eliza was too level-headed for that, but she was persistent when she thought something didn't add up. Dawson followed this lead to the offices of an immigration attorney who had represented several asylum seekers Eliza had mentioned in her research notes. The attorney confirmed meeting with Eliza, but insisted their conversation had been purely academic. Phone records showed that Eliza had called the law office twice in the week before her death, but without more concrete evidence, this potential motive remained speculative at best. By summer 1995, Dawson had exhausted most of the new avenues available to her. She submitted the preserved DNA evidence for updated analysis, which yielded a slightly more complete genetic profile, but still didn't match any known offenders in the limited databases available at the time. In her final report on the Thornton case, Dawson wrote, "The perpetrator of this crime demonstrated planning, patience, and familiarity with Eliza Thornton's routine. The lack of defensive wounds aside from the DNA recovered under the victim's fingernails suggests she may have known or trusted her attacker initially. The crime scene's proximity to Trinity Park indicates the killer either transported the victim there after her death or lured her to that location, both scenarios requiring privacy and time. These factors, combined with the trace evidence of industrial cleaning solvent, continue to suggest someone with occupational access to such materials, possibly employed in building maintenance or janitorial services in the downtown area where the victim was last seen. Her conclusion was sobering. Without new witnesses coming forward or significant advances in DNA technology that would allow for more familial matching or analysis of degraded samples, the Thornton case is unlikely to be resolved through conventional investigative means. As Dawson moved on to other cases, the Thornton file once again went dormant. The pink granite bench near the UTD library continued to bear silent witness to Eliza's memory as students who had never known her passed by. Her parents visited Dallas on the 10th anniversary of her death in 1998, laying flowers at the spot where her body had been found, now indistinguishable from any other patch of grass in Trinity Park. "We still believe someone knows something," Kenneth Thornton told a reporter who covered the anniversary. "People don't just disappear and die without anyone noticing anything. Someone saw something that night. Maybe they didn't realize its significance then, but they're carrying that knowledge with them. We hope that one day their conscience will lead them to come forward." What no one could have predicted was that the key to solving Eliza's murder wouldn't come from a witness's conscience, but from the relentless march of science, a revolution in genetic analysis that would eventually turn the microscopic cells left under a young woman's fingernails into the most powerful evidence imaginable. But that revolution was still years away. And in the meantime, Eliza's killer remained free, perhaps believing that time had erased all traces of his crime. As the millennium turned and a new century began, the Thornton case file gathered dust on a shelf in the Dallas Police Department's archives, waiting for someone to ask the right questions with the right tools at the right time. That moment would come, but not until technology caught up with justice, and not before the killer had enjoyed more than 2 decades of undeserved freedom. The Dallas Police Department's cold case storage facility resembled a library of the forgotten, row after row of metal shelving units filled with cardboard boxes, each containing the fragmented story of a life violently interrupted and a case unresolved. In the spring of 2008, this climate-controlled warehouse on the outskirts of the city received a visitor who would change the trajectory of one of its longest dormant files. Lieutenant Travis Nash had recently been appointed head of the department's revitalized cold case unit, part of a nationwide trend of law enforcement agencies dedicating more resources to unsolved homicides. A former Marine with 20 years of police experience, Nash brought a methodical approach to cold cases that had earned him recognition in law enforcement circles across Texas. "Cold cases aren't really cold," Nash often told his team. "They're just waiting for the right catalyst, new technology, new witnesses, new perspectives. Our job is to provide that catalyst." On that particular morning, Nash was looking for specific types of cases, those with preserved biological evidence that could benefit from advances in DNA technology. The landscape of forensic science had changed dramatically since the early 2000s. Tests that once required substantial amounts of biological material could now be performed with microscopic samples. Databases had expanded exponentially, increasing the chances of finding matches to unknown DNA profiles. As Nash scanned the facility's digital catalog, one case number kept appearing in cross-references to other files, the Eliza Thornton murder from 1988. It had been flagged multiple times over the years by various detectives, including notes from both Mendoza and Dawson, identifying it as a case with untapped forensic potential. Nash pulled the box from the shelf, the cardboard worn at the edges from previous reviewings. Inside, he found the meticulously organized case file, preserved crime scene photos, and, most importantly, documentation of biological evidence still in storage at the forensic lab. The sample of male DNA recovered from beneath Eliza's fingernails had been carefully preserved, a genetic time capsule waiting for technology to catch up with its secrets. "This is exactly the kind of case we're looking for," Nash told his team during their weekly meeting. "Good investigation work, preserved evidence, no obvious suspects. And the DNA technology we have now is light years beyond what they had in '88 or even '95. Nash assigned the case to Detective Rebecca Chen, a former genetic researcher who had joined the police force after completing her PhD in molecular biology, a background that made her uniquely qualified to navigate the increasingly technical world of forensic genetics. The original DNA analysis was rudimentary by today's standards, Chen noted after reviewing the file. They were essentially looking at a handful of markers. Now we can look at hundreds, and at much lower quantities of DNA. If there's anything to find in that sample, we'll find it. Chen's first step was to meet with the Thornton family, now living in Seattle after Kenneth's retirement from his engineering firm. Martha Thornton had passed away from breast cancer in 2002, never seeing her daughter's case resolve. Kenneth, now 75, lived with his second wife, Caroline, whom he had married 5 years after Martha's death. "I've had detectives sitting where you're sitting now every few years," Kenneth told Chen, as they sat in his modest living room overlooking Puget Sound. "Each one promising new techniques, new approaches. I've learned not to hope too much." Despite his cautious words, Chen noticed how carefully Kenneth had preserved newspaper clippings about the case, how quickly he could recall specific details about the investigation, and how his voice still caught when he mentioned Eliza's name. His hope might be guarded, but it hadn't disappeared. "We have tools now that weren't even imagined when Eliza died," Chen explained. "I can't make promises, but I can tell you that cases older than this one have been solved with the technology we're using." Back in Dallas, Chen submitted the preserved DNA evidence for advanced analysis using the latest techniques in genetic profiling. The process took several weeks, a fraction of the time it had taken in 1988, and yielded results that the original investigators could only have dreamed of: a complete genetic profile of the male whose DNA had been found under Eliza's fingernails. The next step was running this profile through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, which had grown from a pilot program in the early 1990s to a comprehensive national database containing millions of DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and unidentified crime scene evidence. Chen waited anxiously for the results, hoping for an immediate match, a name that would instantly transform the investigation. The response, when it came, was disappointing. No match was found in any database. The DNA profile belonged to someone who had never been arrested for a serious crime, or at least had never had their DNA collected and entered into the system. "It's a setback, but not the end," Nash reassured Chen. "If the direct approach doesn't work, we go indirect. Let's start looking at familial DNA." Familial DNA searching was controversial, but increasingly accepted as an investigative technique. Instead of looking for a perfect match to the suspect's DNA, it searched for partial matches that could indicate a biological relative, a parent, sibling, or child of the unknown subject was in the database. This approach had solved several high-profile cold cases, including the identification of the Golden State Killer in California. However, in 2008, Texas had not yet fully embraced familial DNA searching as an investigative tool. Legal hurdles and privacy concerns meant that Chen and Nash would need special approval to pursue this avenue. Approval that might not be granted for a 20-year-old case without significant public pressure or new developments. Chen decided to approach the problem from a different angle. While waiting for the bureaucratic wheels to turn on the familial DNA search request, she revisited every aspect of the original investigation, focusing particularly on the industrial cleaning solvent found on Eliza's clothing. This solvent was key to the original theory that the killer might have worked in building maintenance, Chen told Nash. What if we cross-reference employment records from downtown Dallas businesses in 1988 with the current database of registered sex offenders? It's a long shot, but it might give us something to work with. The research was tedious, comparing fragmentary employment records from 20 years earlier with current criminal databases. Most of the businesses from that era had closed or changed ownership, their records lost or incomplete. But Chen persisted, creating a list of individuals who had worked in maintenance or janitorial positions in downtown Dallas in 1988 and who had subsequently been convicted of violent crimes, particularly those with sexual components. The list contained 37 names. Chen began the slow process of eliminating those who couldn't have committed the crime, those who were incarcerated at the time, who had verifiable alibis, or who simply didn't fit the physical profile suggested by the crime scene evidence. One name on the list caught her attention: Wesley Harrington, currently 53 years old and living in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Harrington had worked for a commercial cleaning service that contracted with several downtown Dallas buildings in the late 1980s, including the office building across from Beacon Books. In 1997, he had been convicted of aggravated assault against a woman in Oklahoma, serving 5 years of a 10-year sentence before being released on parole. What made Harrington particularly interesting was that he had never appeared in any of the original case notes. Somehow, he had flown completely under the radar of the initial investigation, despite working in the immediate vicinity of where Eliza was last seen. "We need to look deeper into this guy," Chen told Nash. "The timing works, the occupation works, and he has a subsequent violent conviction. It's the best lead we've had so far." Nash agreed, and they began building a profile of Harrington's life before and after Eliza's murder. Born in Arkansas in 1955, Harrington had moved frequently throughout his adult life, rarely staying in one place for more than a few years. He had worked various blue-collar jobs, construction, maintenance, janitorial services, and had a sparse criminal record consisting mainly of minor offenses like public intoxication and one charge of simple assault that had been pleaded down to disorderly conduct. His time in Dallas had been brief, from 1986 to early 1989, when he abruptly quit his job and moved to Oklahoma. This timing was significant. He had left the city just months after Eliza's murder, despite having a stable job during an economic downturn. Chen tracked down Harrington's former supervisor at the cleaning company, now retired and living in a nursing home in Fort Worth. Milton Graves, 82, had a surprisingly sharp memory of his former employees. Wes was reliable enough, Graves recalled. Kept to himself mostly. Good with locks, used to help out when tenants would get locked out of their offices after hours. I remember he left sudden-like, said his mother was sick back in Oklahoma and he needed to care for her. Never gave proper notice, just packed up and was gone. This new information added another layer of interest to Harrington as a potential suspect. His skill with locks could explain how Eliza might have been abducted without signs of struggle. Perhaps he had gained her trust by offering help when she was locked out somewhere or needed access to a building. Chen also discovered that Harrington's 1997 assault conviction in Oklahoma involved a 22-year-old woman he had met at a bus stop. According to court records, he had offered her a ride during a rainstorm, then attacked her in his vehicle. The victim had managed to escape and identify Harrington, leading to his arrest and conviction. The parallels are striking, Chen noted in her case report. A young woman, a bus stop, an opportunistic approach. The MO has significant similarities to what we believe happened with Eliza Thornton. By fall 2008, Chen had assembled enough circumstantial evidence to consider Harrington a person of interest in the Thornton case. The next step was obtaining his DNA to compare against the profile from the crime scene. However, as a resident of another state with no current criminal proceedings against him, Harrington couldn't be compelled to provide a DNA sample without substantial legal hurdles. "We need to be creative here," Nash advised. Let's think about how we might obtain a sample through legal but unconventional means. The solution came in the form of discarded DNA, a technique that had been used in other cold cases. If Harrington voluntarily abandoned an item containing his DNA in a public place, investigators could legally collect and test that item without a warrant or his consent. Chen traveled to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where she conducted surveillance on Harrington with the cooperation of local police. For 3 days, she observed his daily routine, his trips to a local diner for breakfast, his visits to a neighborhood bar, his habit of smoking cigarettes outside his apartment building. On the 4th day, Chen's patience was rewarded when Harrington finished a coffee at a diner and left the cup behind. She waited until he was gone, then entered the diner and, with the owner's permission, collected the cup as evidence. Back in Dallas, the cup was processed for DNA. The analysis took just days, but to Chen, it felt like months. When the results finally came in, they were definitive. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the profile from under Eliza Thornton's fingernails. After 20 years, they had finally identified the killer. "We've got him," Chen told Nash, her voice tight with emotion. "It's a perfect match." 20 years later, and Eliza just reached out and identified her killer. But identifying the killer was only the first step. Building a case that would stand up in court after so much time had passed would be challenging. Physical evidence beyond the DNA was limited. Witnesses' memories had faded, and many of the original investigators had retired or passed away. Chen and Nash spent the next 2 months meticulously constructing their case against Harrington, documenting every connection between him and the crime, establishing a timeline of his movements in 1988, and preparing for the complex legal proceedings that would follow an arrest for a 20-year-old murder. In January 2009, with the case carefully assembled and arrest warrants obtained, a joint task force of Dallas police and Tulsa police officers arrived at Wesley Harrington's apartment. The man who answered the door bore little resemblance to the maintenance worker who had disappeared from Dallas 2 decades earlier. Now balding and overweight, with deeply lined features that spoke of hard living, Harrington seemed genuinely confused by the officers at his door. That confusion turned to shock as he was informed that he was under arrest for the 1988 murder of Eliza Thornton. As the officers handcuffed him, one reported that Harrington muttered, "How could they know? It was so long ago." Those words, not quite a confession but far from a denial, would become a key piece of evidence in the case that was about to unfold. After 20 years of silence, justice for Eliza Thornton was finally in motion, propelled forward by advances in science that had transformed a microscopic trace of DNA into an inescapable accusation from beyond the grave. As Harrington was transported back to Dallas to face charges, Kenneth Thornton received a phone call from Detective Chen. "We found him, Mr. Thornton," she said simply. "We found the man who killed Eliza." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Chen wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, Kenneth spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Martha always said that someday someone would figure it out. I just wish she had lived to see it." In Dallas, as news of the arrest broke, former Detective Ray Mendoza, now retired and in his late 60s, watched the press conference on television from his home. As Travis Nash detailed how modern DNA technology had finally solved the case that had haunted the department for 2 decades, Mendoza reached for his phone to call his old partner, Vanessa Wright. "They got him, Vanessa," he said when she answered. "They finally got him." What neither of them knew was that the case was far from over. The arrest of Wesley Harrington was just the beginning of a legal battle that would test the limits of forensic science, the memories of witnesses, and the determination of everyone involved to finally bring closure to one of Dallas's most enduring mysteries. The wheels of justice, having ground exceedingly slow for 20 years, were finally turning. But the path to a conviction would prove to be as challenging as the hunt for the killer had been. And somewhere in the darkness of his cell, Wesley Harrington was already planning his defense, determined not to pay for a crime he had gotten away with for so long. The Dallas County Courthouse stood as a monument to justice, a massive limestone structure whose neoclassical facade had witnessed nearly a century of legal proceedings. On a crisp morning in March 2009, its halls buzzed with unusual energy as prosecutors, defense attorneys, and journalists gathered for the preliminary hearing in a case that had captured the city's attention: the state of Texas versus Wesley Harrington. District Attorney Sofia Ramirez had personally taken charge of the prosecution, recognizing the case's significance both for the community and as a landmark in forensic science. At 43, Ramirez had built her reputation on meticulous preparation and uncompromising pursuit of justice. The Thornton case represented exactly the kind of challenge she had entered public service to tackle, bringing closure to a grieving family while demonstrating the power of modern investigative techniques. The defendant believed that time was his ally, Ramirez told reporters outside the courthouse. He thought that as years passed, evidence would deteriorate, witnesses would forget, and investigators would move on. What he failed to anticipate was that while he was living his life, science was advancing, and Eliza Thornton's DNA evidence was patiently waiting to speak the truth. Lit. Inside the courtroom, Wesley Harrington sat beside his court-appointed attorney, Martin Geller, a veteran defense lawyer known for his aggressive cross-examinations and creative legal strategies. Harrington had maintained his innocence since his arrest, claiming he had never met Eliza Thornton and had no involvement in her death. Judge Eleanor Montgomery, presiding over the case, had already made several key rulings that would shape the proceedings. Most significantly, she had denied the defense's motion to suppress the DNA evidence obtained from Harrington's discarded coffee cup, ruling that he had voluntarily abandoned the item in a public place and therefore had no reasonable expectation of privacy. As the hearing began, Detective Rebecca Chen took the stand as the prosecution's key witness, explaining the process that had led investigators to identify Harrington as a suspect after 20 years. Her testimony was a masterclass in modern forensic investigation, detailing how advances in DNA technology had transformed a partial genetic profile from 1988 into conclusive evidence. The original DNA sample contained approximately 200 picograms of genetic material, Chen explained to the court. In 1988, that was barely enough for the most rudimentary testing. Today, we can generate a complete genetic profile from less than 100 picograms, less than a single cell's worth of DNA. Geller's cross-examination focused on potential contamination of the evidence over its 20-year storage period. Detective Chen, isn't it true that DNA evidence can degrade over time, that storage conditions can affect its reliability, that handling protocols in 1988 were far less stringent than today's standards? Chen acknowledged these points but emphasized the safeguards that had been in place. The sample was properly sealed and preserved in a temperature-controlled environment. More importantly, contamination would typically introduce additional DNA profiles or degrade the existing profile, neither of which occurred here. The profile we obtained was clear, complete, and unambiguous. The defense's strategy became increasingly clear as the hearing progressed. They would not directly challenge the DNA match itself, but would instead question its relevance. Geller suggested alternative explanations for how Harrington's DNA might have ended up under Eliza's fingernails. Perhaps a casual encounter on the street, an accidental brush in a crowded area, or even contamination during the evidence collection process. The prosecution has shown that my client's DNA was present, Geller argued. What they haven't shown, what they cannot show, is how or when that DNA was transferred. DNA is not a timestamp. It cannot tell us when it was deposited or under what circumstances. Judge Montgomery allowed the case to proceed to trial, setting a date 3 months later to give both sides adequate time to prepare. As news of the ruling spread, the story gained national attention, featured on true crime television programs, and discussed in forensic science journals as a prime example of how cold cases could be revitalized through technological advances. For Kenneth Thornton, watching the proceedings from the gallery, the legal arguments seemed almost surreal, technical discussions about picograms and contamination protocols that somehow were supposed to add up to justice for his daughter. He had traveled to Dallas alone, staying in the same hotel where he and Martha had spent those terrible days after Eliza's murder. Each night he would call Caroline in Seattle, giving her a detailed account of the day's events. "It's strange," he told her one evening. "I look at Harrington and try to feel something, hatred, anger, something. But mostly, I just feel tired. 20 years is a long time to wait for answers." As the trial date approached, both prosecution and defense teams intensified their preparations. Ramirez assembled a formidable array of expert witnesses, including Dr. Erica Voss, director of the FBI's DNA analysis unit, who would testify about the reliability of the genetic evidence, and Dr. Michael Grayson, a forensic psychologist who would discuss patterns of predatory behavior consistent with both Eliza's murder and Harrington's subsequent assault conviction in Oklahoma. Geller, meanwhile, focused on creating reasonable doubt. He commissioned his own DNA analysis, hired experts to challenge the prosecution's timeline, and most significantly, began constructing an alibi defense based on employment records suggesting Harrington might have been working at another location on the night of Eliza's murder. The trial began on June 15, 2009. With jury selection taking nearly a week as attorneys from both sides sought to identify jurors who could fairly evaluate scientific evidence while setting aside the emotional impact of a young woman's murder. The final panel consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 26 to 71, including a high school science teacher, a retired nurse, and an IT specialist. District Attorney Ramirez's opening statement was powerful in its simplicity. "This case is about a promise kept," she told the jury. A promise made by dedicated law enforcement professionals that Eliza Thornton would not be forgotten, that her killer would not escape justice simply because technology hadn't yet caught up with his crime. Today, we fulfill that promise. She outlined how the evidence would show that Harrington, with his access to the downtown area, knowledge of Eliza's routine, and possession of industrial cleaning solvents, had abducted the young woman on her way to the bus stop, ultimately taking her life and leaving her body in Trinity Park. The DNA evidence, she emphasized, was not merely suggestive but conclusive, a scientific certainty that placed Harrington in direct physical contact with Eliza during a struggle significant enough for his skin cells to be embedded beneath her fingernails. Geller's opening counter-narrative suggested that the prosecution had built an entire case around a single piece of evidence while ignoring simpler explanations. DNA is not a magic bullet, he reminded the jury. It tells us only that contact occurred, not when, not how, and certainly not why. The prosecution wants you to fill in those blanks with speculation and conjecture, but reasonable doubt lives in those gaps. The trial's first week focused on establishing the basic facts of Eliza's disappearance and murder. Former detectives Mendoza and Wright, both now in their 60s, testified about the original investigation, their voices occasionally catching as they described the crime scene and their frustration at being unable to solve the case during their active careers. Dr. Samuel Hirsch, the medical examiner who had performed Eliza's autopsy in 1988, testified via video deposition, as he was now 86 and unable to travel. His clinical description of Eliza's injuries provided a stark contrast to the vibrant young woman depicted in photographs shown to the jury, images of Eliza at her high school graduation, on hiking trips with friends, smiling from behind the counter at Beacon Books. The trial's second week centered on the DNA evidence, with Detective Chen explaining the process that had led investigators to Harrington. Dr. Voss from the FBI provided expert testimony on the reliability of genetic analysis, explaining to the jury in accessible terms how the 13 genetic markers examined in modern DNA testing created a profile so unique that the chance of a random match was less than 1 in a trillion. To put that in perspective, Voss explained, there are approximately 8 billion people on Earth. The chance of someone other than Mr. Harrington being the source of this DNA is more than 100 times less likely than randomly selecting a specific individual from the entire human population. The defense's cross-examination of Voss focused on the chain of custody for the evidence over its 20-year storage period, suggesting potential opportunities for contamination or mishandling. Voss acknowledged that protocols had evolved significantly since 1988, but maintained that the integrity of the sample had been preserved. If contamination had occurred, she testified, we would expect to see mixed profiles or degradation patterns. Instead, we have a single, clear profile that matches the defendant's DNA with 100% certainty. As the trial entered its 3rd week, the prosecution called witnesses who could place Harrington in the vicinity of Eliza's disappearance. Former co-workers testified that he had regularly worked in buildings near Beacon Books, often taking late shifts that would have put him in the area around the time Eliza was last seen. One witness recalled seeing Harrington with a van registered to the cleaning company on several occasions, a vehicle that had never been examined during the original investigation. The most damaging testimony came from Linda Mercer, Harrington's victim in the 1997 Oklahoma assault case. Now, in her mid-30s, Mercer described how Harrington had approached her at a bus stop during a rainstorm, offering her a ride that had quickly turned into a nightmare. He seemed so normal at first, Mercer testified, deliberately avoiding looking at Harrington in the courtroom. He talked about the weather, asked where I was headed, then something changed, like a switch flipped. His whole demeanor transformed. Mercer's description of the assault bore eerie similarities to what investigators believed had happened to Eliza, an opportunistic approach in a public transit setting, an initial attempt to gain trust, followed by sudden violence. Though Geller objected repeatedly to this testimony as prejudicial, Judge Montgomery allowed it under the legal doctrine, permitting evidence of similar criminal acts to establish pattern and intent. The defense case began in the trial's 4th week, with Geller calling experts who questioned the prosecution's timeline and suggested alternative scenarios for how Harrington's DNA might have been transferred to Eliza. A forensic pathologist testified that skin cells could be transferred through casual contact and remain present for hours afterward, implying that Harrington might have encountered Eliza innocently earlier in the day. Harrington's former supervisor, Milton Graves, testified that work schedules from 1988 suggested Harrington had been assigned to clean an office building across town on the evening of Eliza's disappearance. On cross-examination, however, Ramirez established that employees frequently switched assignments without formal documentation, and that Harrington had keys and access codes to multiple downtown buildings, including those near Beacon Books. The critical moment came when Harrington himself took the stand, a risky move that Geller had advised against, but that Harrington had insisted upon. Now 54, his appearance carefully managed by the defense team in a conservative suit and newly trimmed hair, Harrington projected an image of bewildered innocence. "I never met this young woman," he testified, referring to the photographs of Eliza. "I never harmed her. I can't explain how my DNA got under her fingernails, but there must be some mistake or some innocent explanation." Ramirez's cross-examination was methodical and devastating. She established that Harrington had abruptly left Dallas just months after Eliza's murder, abandoning a stable job during an economic recession. She highlighted inconsistencies in his statements about his whereabouts on the night in question. Most dramatically, She confronted him with his statement upon arrest. How could they know? It was so long ago. "What exactly did you mean by that, Mr. Harrington?" Ramirez asked, her voice deceptively gentle. "I meant, how could they connect me to something that happened so long ago when I had nothing to do with it?" Harrington stammered, his earlier composure cracking. "Nothing to do with it," Ramirez repeated. "Yet your DNA was under her fingernails. Your expertise gave you access to the industrial solvent found on her clothing. Your work schedule placed you blocks away from where she disappeared. Your later conviction shows a pattern of targeting young women at bus stops. And your immediate reaction to arrest wasn't to proclaim your innocence, but to express surprise that you'd been caught after so much time had passed. By the time closing arguments arrived in late July, the courtroom had become a fixture in national news coverage, with legal analysts debating the strength of the DNA evidence versus the circumstantial nature of the remaining case. Both attorneys delivered powerful summations, with Ramirez emphasizing the scientific certainty of the genetic match, and Geller returning to his theme of reasonable doubt in the surrounding circumstances. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching a verdict. As the courtroom fell silent for the announcement, Kenneth Thornton gripped the bench in front of him, his knuckles white. Travis Nash and Rebecca Chen sat together near the front, their expressions carefully neutral despite the enormous investment they had made in the case. Eliza's college roommate, Nora Wilkins, now a mother of 3 living in Houston, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "On the count of murder in the first degree," the jury foreman read, "we find the defendant, Wesley Harrington, guilty." Kenneth Thornton closed his eyes as 2 decades of uncertainty finally ended. Nash placed a supportive hand on Chen's shoulder as she fought to maintain her professional composure. Even Judge Montgomery seemed momentarily affected, removing her glasses and pinching the bridge of her nose before continuing with the proceedings. Sentencing would follow 2 weeks later, with Harrington receiving life imprisonment without possibility of parole, the maximum penalty available, as the crime had occurred before Texas reinstated the death penalty for certain murder cases. As Harrington was led from the courtroom, Kenneth Thornton approached the prosecution table, shaking hands with Ramirez, Nash, and Chen. "Martha always said that someday someone would figure it out," he told them, echoing his words from when he had first learned of Harrington's arrest. "She was right about that, like she was right about so many things. I just wish." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood who was missing from this moment of long-delayed justice. Outside the courthouse, as reporters clamored for statements, Nash and Chen stood slightly apart from the crowd, watching Ramirez handle the press conference with her characteristic poise. 20 years, Nash mused. "I keep thinking about all the advancements that made this possible. The DNA analysis, the databases, the computational power to process it all. If Eliza had been killed even 5 years earlier, or if her case hadn't preserved that biological evidence so carefully." "Science caught up with him," Chen replied, "and it's catching up with others like him. There are thousands of cases out there just like this one, evidence waiting to speak if we just develop the right tools to listen." What neither of them could have anticipated was how quickly those tools would continue to evolve, or how a technique that was barely imaginable in 2009 would soon revolutionize cold case investigations worldwide. Within just a few years, the approach that had identified Harrington through direct DNA comparison would be supplemented by an entirely new methodology that would make it virtually impossible for any killer to escape their own genetic fingerprint, even if they had never been arrested or had their DNA collected. As Chen returned to her office that evening, she found a small package waiting on her desk, a thank you gift from Kenneth Thornton. Inside was a framed photograph of Eliza on her last birthday, smiling into the camera with all the promise of a life that had been cut short, along with a handwritten note. "You gave her back her voice. Thank you for listening to what she had to say." Chen placed the frame on her desk, a reminder of why cold cases mattered, not just as intellectual puzzles or scientific challenges, but as unfinished human stories waiting for their final chapters to be written. What she didn't know then was that the Thornton case, now apparently concluded, would have one more surprising chapter yet to unfold, a scientific epilogue that would change the landscape of forensic investigation forever. Spring 2017 arrived in Dallas with an explosion of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush along the highways, nature's annual reminder of renewal and persistence. In a glass-walled conference room at the Dallas Police Department's Forensic Science Division, a team of specialists gathered around a table strewn with laptops, file folders, and coffee cups. The mood was one of contained excitement, the kind that comes when science offers new possibilities for questions long considered settled. Lieutenant Travis Nash, now approaching retirement, addressed the group with characteristic directness. "I know you're all wondering why we're reopening the Thornton case when we already have a conviction. The short answer is, we're not reopening it. We're using it as a test case for a new investigative technique that could change everything about how we approach cold cases." Beside him, Dr. Amelia Santos, newly hired as the department's genetic genealogy specialist, opened her laptop. At 37, Santos represented the cutting edge of forensic science, a PhD in computational biology with specialized training in the emerging field of investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that combined DNA analysis with traditional genealogical research to identify individuals through their extended family relationships. "Think of it as working backward through a family tree," Santos explained. "Instead of starting with a suspect and testing their DNA directly, we start with the DNA and build a family tree around it until we narrow down to the specific individual it came from." The technique had gained attention after being used successfully in a handful of high-profile cold cases in California and Washington state. Dallas PD had decided to validate the methodology by applying it to a case with a known outcome: the Thornton murder, where Wesley Harrington's identity as the perpetrator had already been confirmed through conventional DNA matching and a subsequent conviction. "If the genetic genealogy approach independently leads us to Harrington," Nash continued, "we'll have strong validation for using this technique on truly unsolved cases. If it doesn't, we need to understand why before applying it elsewhere." Detective Rebecca Chen, now heading the cold case unit that Nash had once led, nodded in agreement. "We've selected this case because the DNA evidence was exceptionally well preserved, and Harrington's identity is established beyond any doubt. It's the perfect control test." Over the next several weeks, Dr. Santos and her team worked to extract and sequence the DNA from the original evidence in the Thornton case, using techniques far more sophisticated than those available during the original investigation or even during Harrington's trial in 2009. The goal was to develop a comprehensive genetic profile that could be compared against public genetic genealogy databases. These databases had proliferated in recent years as consumer DNA testing became increasingly popular, with millions of people submitting samples to learn about their ancestry or connect with distant relatives. While law enforcement couldn't directly access the commercial databases used by companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, they could upload genetic profiles to open-source databases where users had explicitly consented to law enforcement searches. The key difference between this and traditional DNA matching, Santos explained to the team, is that we don't need the perpetrator's DNA to be in any database. We just need some of their relatives, even distant cousins, to have uploaded their profiles. From there, we can triangulate and narrow down the family tree until we identify our unknown subject. By June 2017, Santos had uploaded the genetic profile derived from the DNA under Eliza's fingernails to GEDmatch, a public database used by genetic genealogy enthusiasts. The results were immediate and startling. Multiple hits indicating family relationships, including several individuals who shared enough genetic markers to be classified as second or third cousins to the unknown subject. "This is exactly what we're looking for," Santos told the team during their weekly progress meeting. We have approximately 20 individuals sharing significant DNA with our subject. Now comes the genealogical research phase, building out these people's family trees until we find where they intersect. The process was painstaking. Santos and her research assistants traced the ancestry of each DNA match, constructing elaborate family trees that stretched back generations and branched out to include hundreds of individuals. They searched through birth certificates, marriage records, obituaries, census data, and social media profiles, gradually assembling a complex genetic map centered around the unknown subject's DNA. It's like working a puzzle from the edges inward, Santos explained to Nash during one of his visits to check on their progress. We know what the outer pieces look like, these genetic relatives, and we're trying to fill in the middle to see what picture emerges. By August, after nearly 3 months of intensive research, the team had constructed a comprehensive genetic network that pointed toward a specific family cluster. The DNA belonged to someone descended from the Harrington and Lowell families who had intersected through marriage in rural Arkansas in the 1920s. We've narrowed it down to a specific branch of the family tree, Santos reported. Based on the genetic relationships, age demographics, and geographic movements, our subject is most likely one of these 3 males born between 1950 and 1960. She displayed 3 names on the conference room screen: James Lowell, born 1952, Wesley Harrington, born 1955, and Thomas Harrington, born 1959. Wesley Harrington, Nash read aloud, a note of satisfaction in his voice. Exactly as expected. Not quite, Santos replied, her expression serious. This is where things get interesting and potentially concerning. Let me show you something else. She pulled up a second screen, showing 2 genetic profiles side by side. The DNA from Eliza's fingernails and Wesley Harrington's DNA collected during his 2009 trial. These should be identical, she explained, but they're not. They're extremely similar, similar enough that the standard forensic comparison methods used in 2009 would have declared them a match. But with our current technology, we can see subtle differences that weren't detectable then. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Are you saying Harrington isn't the killer? Chen asked, her voice tense. I'm saying the DNA evidence points to someone very closely related to Wesley Harrington, Santos clarified. Possibly a brother or first cousin with an extremely similar genetic profile, similar enough to be mistaken for a match with the less discriminating technology available in 2009. Nash's expression darkened. Thomas Harrington, Wesley's younger brother. That's our leading theory, Santos confirmed, based on the genetic genealogy results and the more detailed DNA comparison. Thomas Harrington is actually a slightly better match to the crime scene DNA than Wesley. The revelation sent shockwaves through the department. If correct, it meant that Wesley Harrington had been wrongfully convicted, serving 8 years in prison for a crime committed by his brother. The legal and ethical implications were enormous, not just for the Thornton case, but for public confidence in DNA evidence more broadly. We need to be absolutely certain before we proceed, Nash insisted. No press, no leaks, no discussions outside this room until we've verified these findings independently. The team agreed to a 2-pronged approach. Santos would continue refining the genetic genealogy analysis, while Chen would investigate Thomas Harrington's background and whereabouts in 1988, seeking any evidence that might connect him to Eliza's murder or exonerate Wesley. Jen's investigation revealed that Thomas Harrington had indeed lived in Dallas during the relevant period, sharing an apartment with Wesley for several months in 1988. Employment records showed he had worked sporadically as a day laborer but had no steady job. Most significantly, he had left Dallas abruptly in early 1989, around the same time as Wesley, and had largely disappeared from official records afterward. His trail goes cold after 1990. Chen reported. No tax records, no property ownership, no driver's license renewals. It's like he vanished or assumed a new identity. Nash suggested. It wouldn't have been difficult in the pre-digital era, especially if he moved across state lines. Santos, meanwhile, had strengthened her genetic analysis, confirming that Thomas Harrington was indeed the most likely source of the DNA found under Eliza's fingernails. The probability that the DNA belongs to Thomas rather than Wesley is approximately 97%, she concluded. Not absolute certainty, but strong enough that we can't ignore it. The team now faced a profound ethical dilemma: how to proceed with information that could overturn a conviction they had fought so hard to secure. Nash, approaching the end of his career, felt the weight of responsibility keenly. "We have to take this to the district attorney," he decided after consultation with the department's legal counsel. "The truth matters more than a conviction, even one we believed was just." In September 2017, Nash and Chen met privately with District Attorney Eleanor Martinez, who had succeeded Sofia Ramirez when the latter was appointed to a federal judgeship. They presented the new findings, emphasizing both the scientific rigor of the analysis and its troubling implications. "So, you're telling me we convicted the wrong brother?" Martinez asked, her expression grave. "Based on the best evidence available at the time, we identified Wesley Harrington as the perpetrator," Nash replied carefully. "With new technology, we now believe that Thomas Harrington is the actual source of the DNA evidence that formed the cornerstone of our case." Martinez was silent for a long moment. "This is going to be a legal and public relations nightmare," she finally said. "But if we have the wrong man in prison, we need to correct that, regardless of the consequences." The next steps unfolded with careful deliberation. The DA's office quietly began preparing legal filings to review Wesley Harrington's conviction based on newly discovered evidence. Meanwhile, a task force was formed to locate Thomas Harrington and build a case against him if the new theory proved correct. Chen led the search, working with federal agencies to track Thomas through decades of fragmented records. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source: facial recognition software applied to driver's license databases across multiple states. A man named Thomas Lowry, living in rural New Mexico, showed a 94% match to Thomas Harrington's last known photograph. Lowry is his mother's maiden name, Chen noted during a briefing. He's been living under this slightly altered identity for nearly 30 years, working as a handyman and groundskeeper at a small resort near Taos. Married once, divorced, no children. Keeps to himself, according to neighbors. In October 2017, Chen traveled to New Mexico with 2 FBI agents, establishing surveillance on Thomas Lowry's modest home on the outskirts of Taos. For 3 days, they observed his routines: his early morning walks with a German shepherd, his trips to the local hardware store, his solitary dinners at a diner in town. On the 4th day, they followed him to a local cafe, where he ordered coffee and a pastry, eating alone at a corner table. When he left, Chen entered the cafe and, with the owner's permission, collected his discarded coffee cup and napkin as evidence. The DNA analysis was expedited through the FBI lab, with results available within 48 hours. The confirmation was unequivocal. Thomas Lowry was indeed Thomas Harrington, and his DNA was a perfect match to the genetic material found under Eliza Thornton's fingernails in 1988. "We have our man," Chen told Nash via secure video conference, "and it's not Wesley." The arrest was planned with meticulous care. On November 3, 2017, as Thomas tended to the grounds at the resort where he worked, he was approached by Chen and 4 local officers. He offered no resistance, seeming almost resigned as the handcuffs were placed on his wrists. "I always figured someone would come eventually," he reportedly told Chen during the drive to the local sheriff's office. "Just thought it would have happened a long time ago." Back in Dallas, the legal machinery began moving to address Wesley Harrington's wrongful conviction. District Attorney Martinez personally filed a motion to vacate his conviction based on new DNA evidence, and a judge ordered his immediate release pending further proceedings. On November 7, 2017, Wesley Harrington walked out of the Huntsville unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, having served 8 years for a crime he didn't commit. Waiting for him was Rebecca Chen, who had volunteered to personally explain what had happened and to offer what apology she could on behalf of the system that had failed him. "Your brother," she told him simply as they sat in a conference room at the prison. "It was Thomas all along." Wesley's reaction surprised her. There was no outburst of anger, no bitter recriminations, just a slow nod, as if a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. "I suspected," he admitted. "Not at first, but later. Things he said when he visited me during the trial, the way he looked at me. But what was I supposed to do? Accuse my own brother without proof? Who would have believed me?" The brothers' relationship, Chen learned, had been complex and troubled. Thomas, younger by 4 years, had always lived in Wesley's shadow, following him from job to job, city to city, often staying with him temporarily before moving on. Wesley had repeatedly tried to help Thomas find stability, only to watch him sabotage opportunities through impulsive behavior or substance abuse. He was always off somehow, Wesley explained. Not right in the head. Our father was hard on him, harder than he was on me. Thomas would have these rages, then these periods where he'd go quiet for days. I tried to look out for him, but how do you help someone who doesn't want to be helped? Wesley revealed that Thomas had stayed with him in Dallas for several months in 1988, including during the period of Eliza's murder. He borrowed my work van sometimes, used my keys, wore my clothes when his were dirty. People at work might have seen him and thought it was me. This information added crucial context to the original investigation's findings. The witnesses who had placed Wesley near Beacon Books might actually have seen Thomas using his brother's van or wearing his clothes. The industrial cleaning solvent found on Eliza's clothing would have been accessible to Thomas through Wesley's work supplies. Most disturbingly, Wesley disclosed that Thomas had vanished the day after Eliza's body was discovered, only to reappear a week later, claiming he'd been on a bender. When Wesley left Dallas in early 1989, Thomas had initially stayed behind, only rejoining him briefly in Oklahoma before disappearing again. "Did you ever suspect he might have been involved in the girl's death?" Chen asked. Wesley's eyes dropped. "I didn't want to think it, but after I was arrested, some things started making sense. Things he'd said, ways he'd acted. But by then, who would have listened to me? I was the one on trial." The revelation of Wesley's wrongful conviction created precisely the legal and media firestorm that Martinez had anticipated. National news organizations descended on Dallas, with coverage focusing on both the tragedy of Wesley's imprisonment and the remarkable scientific advances that had ultimately revealed the truth. Legal experts debated the implications for other convictions based on earlier DNA technology, while forensic scientists emphasized that the mistake had been caught precisely because of advancements in the field, evidence that the system was becoming more accurate, not less reliable. Kenneth Thornton, now 84 and in failing health, was informed of the developments by Rebecca Chen in a difficult phone call. His reaction reflected the complex emotions of a man who had already endured decades of pain associated with his daughter's case. "So justice wasn't served after all," he said quietly. "Not for Eliza, and not for this man, Wesley, either. We're going to make it right now," Chen promised. "Thomas will face trial. Wesley will be compensated for his wrongful imprisonment. The truth will finally be established." "The truth," Kenneth repeated. "After all this time, I'm not sure what that word means anymore. But I'm glad you didn't stop looking for it." As Thomas Harrington was extradited to Texas to face charges for Eliza's murder, Wesley began the process of rebuilding his life with the assistance of the Innocence Project, which had taken up his case. Under Texas law, he was eligible for substantial compensation for his wrongful incarceration, $80,000 for each year imprisoned, plus an annual annuity, though no amount could restore the years he had lost. In a strange twist of fate, the brothers would soon find themselves on opposite sides of the justice system, one emerging from wrongful imprisonment, while the other entered it for a crime long concealed. The genetic similarity that had led to this extraordinary case of mistaken identity was a reminder of how closely connected they remained, despite the gulf of actions and choices that now separated them. The genetic genealogy technique that had revealed this truth was no longer just a theoretical tool, but a proven method with the power to both exonerate the innocent and identify the guilty. In the months that followed, the Dallas Police Department would establish a dedicated genetic genealogy unit under Dr. Santos's leadership, applying the technique to dozens of long-dormant cold cases. For Rebecca Chen, the Thornton case had come full circle, from her first major cold case breakthrough to a humbling lesson in the limitations of even the most convincing scientific evidence. As she prepared for Thomas Harrington's trial, she kept both Eliza's photo and a news clipping about Wesley's release on her desk, dual reminders of the human lives affected by each decision in the pursuit of justice. The family tree that Santos and her team had so painstakingly constructed now hung on the wall of the cold case unit's conference room, branches and connections spanning generations, ultimately leading to a truth that had remained hidden for nearly 3 decades. It served as a visual testament to the new reality of forensic investigation, that in the modern age, killers could no longer outrun their own DNA, even after decades of freedom, and that justice, however delayed, would eventually find its way through the branches of time and family to reveal the truth. The Dallas County Courthouse had changed little in the 8 years since Wesley Harrington's trial. The same imposing limestone facade greeted Thomas Harrington as he was led up the steps in shackles on a crisp January morning in 2018. At 59, Thomas appeared significantly older than his years. His face weathered by decades of outdoor work and hard living, his posture stooped, his once dark hair now entirely gray and thinning. Media coverage of the case had reached a fever pitch. The story had everything that captivated public attention: a decades-old murder, wrongful conviction, identical DNA, and the scientific breakthrough that had finally revealed the truth. National news vans lined the streets surrounding the courthouse, and journalists jostled for position near the entrance, hoping to capture footage of the man whose genetic fingerprint had finally caught up with him after nearly 30 years. Inside, the prosecution team was led by District Attorney Eleanor Martinez herself, who had decided to personally handle this high-profile case that would likely define her tenure. The evidence against Thomas Harrington was even stronger than what had convicted his brother. Not only the definitive DNA match, but also a growing body of circumstantial evidence unearthed during the renewed investigation. "We now understand how the initial misidentification occurred," Martinez explained during a pre-trial press conference. Thomas Harrington deliberately exploited his physical similarity to his brother, borrowing his work van, using his keys and access cards, even wearing his clothes. He created a situation where witnesses might have seen him but identified Wesley, establishing a layer of confusion that ultimately served as his cover. Thomas had been appointed a public defender, Gabriela Reyes, a respected attorney with 20 years of experience in capital cases. Her defense strategy focused not on denying Thomas's involvement, the DNA evidence made that virtually impossible, but on challenging the charge of first-degree murder, suggesting that Eliza's death might have been unplanned, perhaps resulting from a confrontation that escalated out of control. The trial began on February 12, 2018, almost 30 years to the day after Eliza Thornton's murder. Judge Miguel Santiago, known for his no-nonsense courtroom management, presided over the proceedings. The jury selection had been particularly challenging, given the extensive media coverage, But eventually, a panel of 8 women and 4 men was seated, each having assured the court they could set aside prior knowledge of the case and judge solely on the evidence presented. The prosecution's opening statement traced the long arc of the investigation from the initial discovery of Eliza's body in 1988 through the mistaken conviction of Wesley Harrington to the genetic genealogy breakthrough that had finally led to Thomas. Martinez emphasized that despite the passage of time, the fundamentals of the case remained clear. Eliza Thornton, a promising young student, had been murdered, and her killer had evaded justice for nearly 3 decades by allowing his brother to take the blame. Thomas Harrington didn't just commit murder, Martinez told the jury. He committed a second crime by his silence, allowing his own brother to be convicted and imprisoned for what he had done. Today, we have the opportunity to correct both injustices. The defense countered with a narrative of Thomas as a troubled individual whose life had been shaped by childhood trauma and undiagnosed mental illness. We're not here to dispute that Thomas Harrington had contact with Eliza Thornton on the night of her death, Reyes acknowledged. The DNA evidence establishes that clearly. What we ask is that you consider the full context of that encounter. The state of mind, the circumstances, the absence of premeditation that distinguishes a tragic incident from a calculated murder. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over the next 2 weeks. Dr. Emilia Santos explained the genetic genealogy process that had identified Thomas, using visual aids to help the jury understand how the technique had distinguished between the nearly identical DNA of the brothers. Former Detective Rebecca Chen, now chief of the Cold Case Unit, detailed the renewed investigation that had tracked Thomas to New Mexico and uncovered his decades of living under a slightly altered identity. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Wesley Harrington himself, who had agreed to testify for the prosecution. Looking considerably older than his 63 years, Wesley spoke with quiet dignity about his relationship with his younger brother and the devastating impact of his wrongful conviction. "I always tried to look out for Thomas," Wesley testified. "Our father was harsh, especially with him. Thomas never seemed to find his footing in life. He'd get work, lose it, move somewhere new, start over. I let him stay with me whenever he needed to, gave him money when I could. I never imagined he could do something like this, or that he would let me take the fall for it." Wesley described how Thomas had stayed with him in Dallas during the period of Eliza's murder, often borrowing his work van and using his keys to access buildings where Wesley's cleaning company had contracts. He recounted how Thomas had disappeared immediately after news of the murder broke, returning days later with no explanation for his absence. Most damning was Wesley's account of a prison visit Thomas had made during his trial in 2009. He said something I didn't understand at the time. He said, "Sometimes one of us has to pay for both of us. That's how it's always been. I thought he was talking about our childhood, how I'd often take punishment meant for both of us. Now, I realize what he really meant." The defense cross-examination sought to highlight inconsistencies in Wesley's recollections and suggest that his testimony might be colored by resentment over his wrongful imprisonment. Reyes established that Wesley had never explicitly suspected Thomas of the murder until after his own arrest, raising questions about whether his current certainty was influenced by subsequent events rather than contemporaneous observations. As the trial entered its 3rd week, the prosecution presented expert testimony on the industrial cleaning solvent found on Eliza's clothing, now definitively linked to supplies that would have been accessible to Thomas through his brother's employment. Cell phone records from 2009, preserved during Wesley's trial, revealed calls from Thomas to Wesley that had spiked in frequency immediately after the DNA evidence was first discovered, suggesting Thomas had been closely monitoring the investigation that would wrongfully target his brother. The most surprising development came when the prosecution called Meredith Lowry, Thomas's ex-wife from New Mexico, who had come forward after learning of his arrest. Though they had been divorced for over 15 years, Meredith provided crucial testimony about Thomas's behavior during their marriage. He had nightmares, she testified. Terrible ones, where he'd wake up shouting about the girl at the bus stop. When I'd ask him about it the next morning, he'd shut down completely, refused to talk. Once, when he was drunk, he told me he'd done something terrible in Dallas before he met me, something his brother had paid for. I thought he was speaking metaphorically, that maybe he'd stolen something or lost a job that caused problems for his brother. I never imagined. Her voice trailed off as she looked at Thomas, who sat motionless at the defense table, his eyes fixed on the floor in front of him. The defense case began in the 4th week, focusing primarily on Thomas's mental health. A psychiatrist testified that based on a comprehensive evaluation, Thomas displayed symptoms consistent with antisocial personality disorder, complicated by post-traumatic stress stemming from childhood abuse. While not rising to the level of legal insanity, these conditions, the expert suggested, could have impaired Thomas's ability to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder. The question of whether Thomas would testify himself remained open until the final day of the defense presentation. Ultimately, against his attorney's advice, he chose to take the stand, a decision that would prove pivotal to the case's outcome. Thomas spoke in a quiet, often halting voice, describing his difficult childhood, his struggles with employment and relationships, and his complicated feelings toward his more successful older brother. When questioned directly about Eliza Thornton, however, his demeanor changed noticeably. His responses became clipped, his gaze evasive. "I remember seeing her at the bus stop," he admitted. "Pretty girl, student. I was driving Wes's van, making a delivery for him. I stopped to offer her a ride since it was getting dark. We talked. Things happened." "Ooh, what things, Mr. Harrington?" Martinez asked during cross-examination. "She got scared when I took a wrong turn. Started yelling. I just wanted her to be quiet. I never meant for her to die. Yet you left her body in Trinity Park and let your brother take the blame for your actions. Why?" Thomas was silent for a long moment. "Wes always got away with everything, always the good son, the successful one, I thought, just once. He should know what it feels like to be me, to have everything go wrong, to not be believed." A murmur ran through the courtroom at this admission. Judge Santiago called for order, his gavel echoing in the suddenly silent room. "And for 30 years, you've lived with this knowledge," Martinez pressed. "I tried to forget," Thomas replied, his voice barely audible. "Changed my name, moved around, but it was always there, in my dreams, in my head. When they arrested Wes, I thought about coming forward. But then I figured, he had a better chance with lawyers and trials than I ever would, and part of me thought maybe he deserved it anyway." The coldness of this statement seemed to affect the jury visibly, several members recoiling slightly in their seats. The defense attempted to redirect, emphasizing Thomas's mental health issues and difficult life circumstances, but the damage had been done. Thomas's own testimony had revealed not just his guilt, but a callousness that undermined any sympathy his personal history might have generated. Closing arguments presented stark, contrasting narratives. The prosecution portrayed Thomas as a calculating killer who had not only taken a young woman's life, but had then allowed his own brother to be punished for his crime. A double betrayal that demanded the fullest measure of justice. The defense acknowledged Thomas's responsibility for Eliza's death, but urged the jury to consider it manslaughter rather than premeditated murder, pointing to his mental health issues and the apparently unplanned nature of the encounter. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree, with an additional finding of special circumstances for the extraordinary measures taken to evade justice. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, Thomas showed little reaction, his expression as blank as it had been throughout much of the trial. In the gallery, Wesley Harrington closed his eyes briefly, his face a complex mixture of relief and sorrow. Rebecca Chen, seated nearby, reached over to squeeze his shoulder in a gesture of support. The formal sentencing took place 2 weeks later, on March 12, 2018, exactly 30 years and 7 months after Eliza Thornton's murder. Judge Santiago allowed victim impact statements, beginning with Kenneth Thornton, who had traveled from Seattle despite his failing health to address the court. At 84, Kenneth moved slowly to the podium, supported by a cane. He carried a framed photograph of Eliza, which he placed on the stand before him. His voice, though weakened by age, carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. 30 years ago, I lost my daughter. 7 years ago, I lost my wife. Martha never got to see this day, the day when the right person would finally be held accountable for taking our child from us. He paused, gathering himself. I've had to say goodbye to Eliza twice now, once when we buried her, and again when I thought justice had been served with the wrong man's conviction. Today, I hope I can finally let her rest, knowing that the truth has prevailed, even if it took far longer than it should have. He turned slightly to look directly at Thomas. I don't have the energy for hatred anymore. What I do have is gratitude for the persistence of those who never stopped looking for the truth, even when it meant admitting a terrible mistake. That's what Eliza would have wanted. Truth above all else. She believed in justice, even when it's difficult, even when it requires us to acknowledge our own errors. Wesley Harrington also addressed the court, his statement brief but powerful. Thomas and I share the same blood, the same DNA, so similar that science itself was confused, but we made different choices, and those choices have led us to very different places. I've spent 8 years in prison for something I didn't do. I could be angry about that, and sometimes I am, but mostly I'm grateful to be standing here today to have lived long enough to see the truth come out. He looked at his brother for the first time during the proceedings. Thomas, I wish I could have helped you before it came to this. I wish you had found the courage to tell the truth before both our lives were destroyed. Maybe someday you'll understand what you've taken from so many people, from Eliza, from her family, from me, and ultimately from yourself. When Thomas was given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, he declined with a small shake of his head. Judge Santiago proceeded to impose the mandatory life sentence, adding a formal judicial finding that the case represented an extraordinary miscarriage of justice that extended far beyond the original crime. As Thomas was led from the courtroom, the 3-decade saga of Eliza Thornton's murder approached its conclusion. Outside the courthouse, District Attorney Martinez held a press conference addressing both the conviction and the systemic issues it had revealed. Today's sentence cannot restore the years lost by Wesley Harrington or bring Eliza Thornton back to her family, Martinez acknowledged. What it can do is remind us that justice, while sometimes delayed, must never be abandoned. The scientific advances that ultimately revealed the truth in this case are now being applied to dozens of other unsolved crimes. We owe it to victims and their families to use every tool at our disposal to find the truth, no matter how long it takes. In the months that followed, the implications of the case rippled through the criminal justice system. The Texas legislature passed the Thornton Act, which established more rigorous standards for DNA evidence and created a special fund for the application of advanced genetic techniques to cold cases. Wesley Harrington received a formal apology from the state, along with financial compensation for his wrongful imprisonment, which he used to establish a foundation supporting both wrongfully convicted individuals and victims of violent crime. Dr. Amelia Santos and her team expanded their genetic genealogy work, applying the technique to dozens of long-dormant cases. Within the first year, they identified suspects in 5 previously unsolved homicides dating back to the 1970s, bringing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. For Rebecca Chen, now heading the expanded cold case unit, the resolution of the Thornton case represented both a professional triumph and a humbling reminder of the limitations of even the most convincing evidence. The pink granite bench near the UTD library bearing Eliza's name had weathered over the decades, but students still passed it daily, most unaware of its significance or the long, winding path to justice it represented. Kenneth Thornton returned to Seattle after the trial, his health continuing to decline. 6 months after Thomas's sentencing, he suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. Despite his physical limitations, he worked with a writer to document Eliza's story and the extraordinary investigation that had spanned 3 decades, determined that the lessons of the case would not be forgotten. In December 2018, as Thomas Harrington began serving his life sentence at the same Huntsville unit, where his brother had been wrongfully imprisoned, Kenneth received an unexpected visitor at his assisted living facility in Seattle. Wesley Harrington, having learned of Kenneth's stroke, had flown across the country to meet the father of the young woman whose death had entangled their lives in such tragic ways. Their meeting, private and unrecorded, lasted over 3 hours. Neither man ever publicly shared all that was discussed, but nurses reported seeing them looking through an album of photographs of Eliza together, 2 men united by loss and injustice, finding some measure of peace in each other's company. 1 year later, on the anniversary of Thomas's conviction, Kenneth Thornton passed away peacefully in his sleep. In accordance with his wishes, his ashes were scattered alongside those of his wife Martha and their daughter Eliza in a small private ceremony attended by family members and a few key individuals from the investigation, including Rebecca Chen and Travis Nash. Wesley Harrington was also present, having maintained a correspondence with Kenneth in his final months. As the ceremony concluded, Wesley placed a single white rose on the memorial bench at UTD that bore Eliza's name, a gesture of respect for the young woman he had never met, but whose fate had become inextricably linked with his own. The case that had once been known simply as the Trinity Park murder was now taught in forensic science programs across the country, a testament to both the remarkable advances in DNA technology and the human determination that had ultimately revealed the truth. Textbooks featured side-by-side genetic profiles of the Harrington brothers, illustrating how technology had evolved to distinguish between what once appeared identical. In the cold case unit's offices, the elaborate family tree that had led investigators to Thomas Harrington remained on display, a visual reminder of how the branches of genetics, genealogy, and justice had finally intersected after 30 years of separation. Beside it hung photographs of both Eliza Thornton and Wesley Harrington, honoring both the victim of the crime and the man who had unjustly paid for it. The genetic revolution that had ultimately solved the case continued to advance, with each new technological breakthrough making it increasingly difficult for those who committed violent crimes to escape the genetic fingerprints they inevitably left behind. In police departments across the country, detectives revisited long-dormant files with renewed hope, knowing that the science that had finally brought justice in the Thornton case might do the same for countless other victims, still waiting for their stories to reach their true conclusions. For Eliza Thornton, justice had been delayed by 3 decades, diverted by a scientific limitation that had since been overcome, and complicated by the extraordinary twist of nearly identical DNA. Yet in the end, the truth had emerged, not through a single dramatic revelation, but through the patient, persistent efforts of individuals committed to following evidence wherever it led, even when it meant acknowledging that justice had taken a wrong turn. In that sense, the final chapter of Eliza's story offered both closure and caution, a reminder that justice, like science itself, remains a human endeavor, subject to both remarkable advances and humbling limitations. What had begun with a jogger's discovery in Trinity Park on a summer morning in 1988 had finally reached its conclusion, transformed by time, technology, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. that had ultimately revealed what had long remained hidden, that sometimes justice needs not just persistence, but the courage to admit when it has followed the wrong path, and the determination to find the right one, no matter how long the journey might take.